How's it going, guys? My name is Yansel. Welcome back to a new video. For today, I've got another dubstep production BTS for you guys, and I'm gonna be using my new song Psycho Music, which is kind of inspired by the more hardcore subgenres of dubstep, like Tearout. And I'll show you how I approach the production of this type of genre. I'll show you my sound palette, how I process the sounds, and how I structure them. Just before we begin, a little disclaimer. I'm gonna be mentioning some third-party plugins that I'm using here, and I wanna make it clear that I am not endorsed or sponsored by anything I'm about to show you. This video's sole purpose is to show you what I use and how I use them. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so before we move any further, I want to talk about tempo. For more of these Tearout adjacent dubstep genres, the more hardcore ones, the tempo sits at around 130 to around 150 BPM. So now let's move on to our instruments. Starting off in the intro, we have this little synth melody that's playing. And on our effects rack of the synth, we have an EQ cutting out all the lows at 250 Hz. And we have this low pass filter that's automated to sweep away to create this emerging effect. And right underneath the EQ, we have this tremolo stuttering effect that's also automated. For bass, we have this orchestral drone bass playing on the second half of our intro, and we have an EQ on that cutting out up to 60 Hz. On top of our melody and bass, we have some riser effects, and the processing for the risers are very simple. We have our EQ cutting out the lows, and we have some high-end character with a high shelf or a bell curve on the higher frequencies. For an added touch, I added this downing boom, which is kind of like a contrary motion. While the pitch of the risers are going up, the pitch of the downing boom, well, descends. For percussions in our intro and build-up, we have a kick drum. We also have a crash cymbal playing all the way into the build-up, along with a very hectic hi-hat pattern to add some dramaticism. For the processing of the kick, I've added a bit crusher with some drive to make it nice and fat, along with an EQ cutting out some of the sub frequencies and bringing out the high frequencies. And that's a similar case for the crash cymbal as well. Here we have our EQ cutting out the lows and bringing out the highs, along with a little bit of bit crush distortion to push it through the mix. And the same processing goes for the hi-hat as well. So right before our main percussion begins, I have this little tom sound which I've tuned to fit our key of E flat minor in the song. And here is the intro and the build-up all together. Okay, so here we are now in our first drop. But before we get into the drop, I want to talk about the little vocal sample that I have here right before the build-up transitions into the drop. So for a little variety, I've gone for this very high-pitched female vocal with some heavy processing done to it. So I hope you guys can follow along. First up, we've got an EQ cutting out the lows, some unwanted resonances, and increasing some high-end character. Next, I've got two compressors with these settings. Then I've got a bit crusher with some drive, some downsampling, and the mix put up to 32.5%. A vocal transformer with the pitch down to -7 and the formant down to -12 and the mix at 50%. Next up, we've got some pitch correction with the key tuned to G sharp, natural minor, and the response turned all the way down, or in this case the mix of the pitch corrector turned all the way down to get the maximum out of this effect. Afterwards, I've added another bit crusher with some drive to really fatten up the vocal. And just for an added touch, I've added some tube saturation with this BPB saturator. And the way I laid out this audio sample is by cutting up the first syllable so that it plays in a groove and the rest of the audio playing immediately after. I'll play that along with a click track to show you what that sounds like. And just as an added bonus, for the vocal, I've added some reverb with the wet knob up to 10 dB, and the plugin itself being sent through a bus, with the bus parameter being set to -12.5. So here we are at the actual drop now, and let's start with our dubstep basses. So unlike my previous video, I've decided to place our main basses, its other layers, and its sub bass all in one summing stack and process them all together. First we have our main bass. Then we have a transient and tonal layer. And we have a sub bass to really thicken it up. And this entire bass summing stack is processed with some OTT, an enveloper to bring out the transients, a little bit of EQ to bring out some of the high-end character, and some sidechain compression to bring out the kick when it plays. So I'll do a little before and after. And just to add some dramaticism, I have automated the low pass filter to sweep away on the summing stack itself so that it affects all of the sounds at once. So our second bass is also layered the same way, where we have our main bass, transient layer, and sub bass all processed in one summing stack. Here we have our main bass, transient layer, and sub layer. And the processing is more or less the same as the first bass, except this time I have automated a high pass EQ. So what makes the second bass different apart from its sonic character is how it has been structured. It's been structured in a way where we have a lot more of a triplet feel when played along with the drums. I'll play it with the click track to show you what I mean. I've also added some additional sound effects, some squeals, plucks, and bass shots to really spice up the drop. Before the end of our first drop, we introduced a third dubstep bass, layered and processed similarly to the first two, except we've got two new plugins on our effects rack. First is the volume stuttering effect, and this ensemble vibrato effect, both of which are automated. As you heard, here was the vibrato, and here was the volume stuttering effect. You can hear the volume stuttering effect in more detail in the second drop. And as an added touch for the third bass layer, I've added this textural element with the EQ taking out all of the lows and mids, the vibrato, and some sidechain compression. Here's a little before and after of the third bass. Furthermore, in this section, we have some more sound effects, namely our yays and yoys. A couple of scream sounds. And this sort of panned, warping electronic effect. For this first channel strip with the yoys, the effects are pretty simple. We have some EQ cutting out 50 Hz and increase the frequency with a bell curve at 2000 Hz, along with some bit crusher with added drive and decreased resolution to 8-bit. And for the scream and the electronic sound has been EQ'd, cutting out the frequencies up to 200 Hz and increasing a high shelf at 2000 Hz, along with tube saturation at around 50%. And accompanying the second sound effect, we have some vocal chops, all processed the same way as the first vocal chop. Here's the second half of the drop all together, along with the drums. Alright, now we're going to move on to the midsection of our song. And to emphasize the shift from the first drop to the midsection, we're going to use this boomer effects, kind of like an impact sound. And here is how that's processed. With an EQ cutting out up to 2800 Hz, because we want this impact sound to be very subtle. And right underneath the EQ we have this bit crusher with a little bit of drive. For the main melody we have the same synth melody playing from the intro, but I've used a different preset on Shaperbox to alter the sound further. And because this midsection is a little melodic, we also have some synth chords that I've created. And here it is with the melody. And the processing for these jelly pad chords is very simple as well. We're cutting out 40 Hz in the EQ and using the bell curve to boost up the frequencies at 2000 Hz, along with subtle tube and tape saturation. For bass, we have this orchestral drone bass from before. But to make it much thicker sounding, I've added this sub bass on, since we've already removed some of the sub frequencies from the orchestral bass. Another key feature I'd like to mention is the changes in the vocal chop on the second half of our midsection. While processing stays the same, minor changes include this panning effect, along with this tape delay from a bus send, with the repetition set at quarter dotted notes. And that gives a really cool effect when played with the click track. And finally, here is the midsection in its entirety. So I hope you guys learned something from that video, or at the very least found it interesting. I'll have streaming and YouTube links for my track Psycho Music in the description below for you to check out. Also a huge shout out to my buddy Zahra, who kindly provided the vocal samples for this track. I'll have some of her links in the description as well if you want to show her your support. And with that guys, thank you so much for watching. Like, comment and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. And I'll see you guys soon in the next video. Take care.